Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back from the break. The next talk will be given by none other than me, and it will be on secure bootloaders in embedded devices. So just a little background of who am I. As all of you know, I'm Patrik Sivak, and I'm currently working as a stock analyst at ISS World Services. So thanks to this, a majority of my daily work is in digital forensics and incident response. However, long before I started doing work in digital forensics, I was doing a lot of hardware hacking and open source work on a number of projects such as HTX and similar. And before starting in cybersecurity, I was a software engineer and a research assistant in astrophysics, both at Warsaw University and at Cambridge. And also, it's my first time at Hack Summit. So with that short intro out of the way, let's jump straight into the presentation. So as many of you here are from the backgrounds of IT security and IT incident response, it might beg the question of why do we even care about embedded devices and bootloaders? Well, there's a number of reasons for that, and bootloaders have very extensive permissions, and if compromised, can have essentially full access to any data or credentials stored on the device, unless they're encrypted at the OS or application level, which an embedded device usually they are not, unfortunately. And compromised bootloaders can hide, and they can hide very well. And if you're considering a malicious bootloader, for instance, as part of a supply chain attack, so if you already received, for example, a new smart thermostat with a malicious bootloader loaded on it, good luck trying to detect that. It can be next to impossible. And it can perform basically any actions within the OS. It can load kernel modules. It's pretty much as privileged as a rootkit, in many cases, even more. So considering the lackluster monitoring often present in embedded devices due to power constraints, personally, I've never seen an EDR deployed on any smart thermostats or IoT devices. So oftentimes the only hope of detecting any sort of malicious activity is to essentially external monitoring. So if you're, for example, doing full packet capture at the network perimeter, but that's a topic that we're kind of not going to get into here too much, considering that that's for long sleeves. And lastly, bootkits can be very challenging to eradicate. Considering in the normal incident response, usually you don't fully reimage. You can delete some files, killing processes, deleting registry keys, and similar. However, with bootkit, even if you try and reinstall the entire operating system, or attempt to, for instance, roll back a program to a known state, you're not going to solve anything. And there are pretty much very few options for eradication, and essentially all of them in some shape or form boil down to debug interfaces and physical access. And at that point, it's usually much easier to just fully reimage the device. Because if you think about it, if you're updating, for example, a smart thermostat, you're uploading it via the bootloader, and if the bootloader is already compromised, then it's not gonna allow you to update it that easily. And here's just a quick overview of today's presentation. So we're going to start with just a simple overview of what is bootloader, and then we're going to talk a bit about the difference between malicious and insecure ones, and then some bootkits and rootkits, and some of the security features that the modern bootloaders can offer these days. And then we're going to walk through a few steps to creating a more secure and hardened bootloader using U-Boot, which is a very popular open source bootloader. I wanted to originally do a demo for this presentation. However, I fried the board. I wanted to do this on about a week ago, and I didn't manage to get a replacement one. So unfortunately, no demo today on this one. So before we get started, let's just make sure everyone understands what the bootloader is, and especially in the context of embedded devices, since, as I said, many of you are here from the IT side of incident response, which is and the boot process is very different in embedded devices, and also this is not a topic that's commonly discussed in IT incident response. And the overly simplified answer is that the bootloader is a small piece of code that facilitates, among other things, the loading of the operating system. And as we can see in here in this diagram, it consists of multiple stages. And of course, this can depend wildly on the complexity of the system. This is I try to encompass a pretty average bootloader setup here. Although on many devices, the unfortunate truth is that the verification steps are oftentimes skipped or only done, for instance, at the bootloader verifies the OS image and nothing lower. So then the first stage we have here, the ROM bootloader. These are pretty much the first instructions that a CPU will load, and these initialize very basic functions of the MCU, such as, for instance, initiating clocks, maybe some pins, although not even that is usually common. And then it does the only thing that it's supposed to, which is locate the SPL or the secondary program loader, which is oftentimes essentially a mini bootloader that the device has. And once it locates it, it loads and verifies the SPL and using the signatures, which we're going to discuss later. And then it passes the control straight to the SPL. And the secondary program loader is basically a mini bootloader. For the reason is that usually it's not feasible to load the full bootloader due to the size of the image. So this one, again, just initializes some further hardware, usually RAM initialization and some RAM paging appears at this level, some IO, storage, partitioning, things like that. And then it loads the main bootloader. And now here's kind of where the fun begins, usually. Because this is, for instance, this would be U-boot, for instance, or Bearbox or other types of bootloaders in embedded devices. And these ones initialize the network connections, do some memory optimization, things like that. And then it, if applicable, it can locate any boot options. So for instance, if you have dual boot on embedded devices, which is not very common, but actually can happen. Usually it's more common if you're doing updates. So it serves to swap out the partitions that load the operating system. It opens debug interfaces, so for instance, U-boot shells and similar. And then it verifies the kernel image and loads it and passes the control to it. Now, this might prompt some of you to ask, why do we even need so many stages of bootloaders? Wouldn't it just be easier to have a bigger code in ROM and load the OS directly? The short answer is no. That's for a very good reason, that there is a very limited memory that is practically stored in ROM. It might be at best a few kilobytes of opcodes in ROM, and it's immutable. So it gets basically etched into the ROM at the factory, and no one's editing that without the destroying in a classical ROM setup. So having just basically a full bootloader in ROM would mean that the ROM would have to be customized to every version of the operating system and every hardware configuration you might have, because the bootloader also takes care of initializing any hardware and peripherals, as I mentioned before. So in this way, it's a lot easier and a lot more practical to have just the most simplest ROM code possible, and then to kind of essentially staggered boot up through these many stages of bootloaders, because every operating system version, every board will have a different device tree and will require different ways it needs to be powered on. And now there's an important distinction we have to make, and that's such between a malicious and unsecure bootloader. Malicious bootloaders is if an attacker has managed to load their own modified version of a bootloader, resulting in essentially a full compromise of the device. This can happen through a number of ways. However, all of them are very complex attack vectors that require extensive resources to pull off, such as, for instance, supply chain attack, where, for instance, an attacker might compromise the factory or the shipment heading for your company of some new smart thermostats or something like that, and physically load the malicious version of the bootloader or operating system onto the device. These are, these are very rare and are essentially nation-state level attacks. And then there is the second part, which is an insecure bootloader, which unfortunately is a lot more common. There's a number of security features that can be enabled in auto bootloaders, well, essentially all of them, from signing that verifies the integrity of the operating system, or SPL verifying next stage bootloaders, and similar. And unfortunately, the bad thing is, even if they are enabled, usually people's laziness wins and they use root and password for the debug interfaces, if at all. For instance, just about a month ago, I bought a second-hand router for a few zloty. And it was probably about 5-6 years old model. I tried probing the UART pins on it, and it gave a fully root shell, and I could get, the previous user's password to the Wi-Fi and stuff like that. It's like a generic ISP provided router, which probably half of you have at home these days. So that's kind of a second note to do not sell any hardware secondhand unless you're sure that there's been all data wiped from it and everything. But it's things like this that really kind of show you how usually it's convenience that wins in embedded devices. And here the important thing is that the unsecure bootloader can lead to a malicious one, because if you have a URL shell enabled on the device, attacker can swap it out easily, even in shipment, and that drastically reduces the difficulty of the attack. Because if you think about it, it's either you can load a new bootloader directly through the URL shell just by probing a few pins, or you have to essentially desolder the memory chip from it or swap out the micro SD card. So those are very different and much more noticeable attack vectors. And I'm sure almost all of you have heard about a rootkit, especially in the context of computers. But this is not talk about rootkits, and I'm not going to get too deep into that. But there's an important distinction I would like to make between these two. And bootkits can be almost thought of as a subsidy of rootkits. And in oversimplified term, there, as I discussed before, malicious bootloader, giving the attacker uninhibited access over a device. And even if you would have some form of detection on your IoT devices, then you're not going to find it locally. You might only find artifacts. And even if you had some local essentially versions of Sysmon or some local action agents, then those would be able to most likely be unhooked just by a bootkit, because it has essentially ring 0, or I would almost say sometimes ring -1 per se access. And let's kind of take a few minutes to discuss the security features that modern microcontrollers and bootloaders can provide, and these are there, but most people choose not to use them just for convenience, is the short answer. And the root of trust is basically the foundation of all security in the boot process. And it starts with hardware. So for instance, this is the equivalent of what would be a TPM on a computer. So this would be cryptographic keys stored inside of the ROM code, which is unmodifiable. And this is where some MCUs have the support that the ROM code can actually verify the already SPL bootloader, and in this way ensure that only the verified SPL gets loaded. And as I said, these ones essentially this root of trust can be broken in any simple way, unless you have, for instance, physical access to the device and manage to swap out the chip or things like that, which is, at that point, I would say good luck. And building on that is secure boot. And this is, as I was mentioning before, there's the chain of trust from bootloaders. So the ROM bootloader verifies the SPL, and then the SPL can verify the actual bootloader, and bootloader can verify the integrity of the operating system. And then we have update verification. So in embedded devices, keeping the firmware, software and firmware up to date is crucial. To be fair, it's not happening as often as it should be. And when it does, it needs to make sure that only authorized updates are applied. And this is where signing comes to play. Because any new software that's installed, the device can verify the cryptographic signature of the update to ensure its integrity. So imagine if you're, let's say, updating the firmware on a generic device. Usually the process goes that the existing firmware receives the request to update it. It pulls down the new version onto a different partition on the storage device. Following that, it hashes it and checks if it has the correct signatures, and then it can essentially give control to the new software, which then can delete the old firmware from the device. And kind of similar to this, there is an anti-rollback protection. I'm sure this is going to be something that's concept that's very familiar to people working in IT, incident response, such as rolling back to an old version of a vulnerable firmware, for example, or software. So attackers may try and swap out the intercept the update on the fly, or swap out the files used for the updates with older, less secure firmware, maybe with known vulnerabilities or known exploits for them. And that's why a lot of MCUs these days implement something called anti-rollback protection, which essentially there's a small hardware timer or hardware counter or fuses that can be only incremented, and if the version number is lower than the current one, it will not allow the update, and it will essentially fail in a secure manner, preventing an old update to be pushed to the device. And next thing we have stuff like trusted execution environment, which is not a feature that many MCUs offer, but it's essentially in short terms, because this is a topic we could get into for hours. It's essentially a partitioned off side of the MCU that ensures that if there is a vulnerability, for instance, some memory leakage or stuff like that, this would essentially prevent it, because it executes in a completely different part of the MCU. And however, as I said, this is usually only on very high-end MCUs, or usually only maybe FPGAs. And then there's another thing which is not that often talked about, but it's quite important, which is physical tamper protection. Some devices these days, not that many to be fair, offer physical protection. So for instance, there might be fuses that get blown if someone tries to open the device, and that would essentially yield the device useless. However, these are not that common and are only in maybe very high security areas, if even that. And usually it's a custom solution and nothing that comes from any OEM. And now let's talk a bit about how to create a bootloader, because that's a process that I don't think is actually known to many unless you're currently working in embedded devices. So here's kind of a pretty, this is a diagram for how an average bootloader might be built. So first thing, we have preparing the toolchain, and this is essentially a toolchain or a collection of tools, such as cross-tool-ng is a very popular one, because you're compiling for different architectures, for instance, whether it's ARM, x86, RISC, etc. And you still need to create a toolchain for this, which includes the C libraries, linkers, loaders, etc. So it's basically everything you would need to build and compile the bootloader, the kernel, and to essentially eventually burn it onto, load it onto a storage medium. And the next step we have, once the toolchain is in place, we have to configure and compile the bootloader, or in our cases, I'm using U-boot as a good example. We have U-boot is a highly customizable bootloader, which I will actually talk a bit more about at a later date. But we have to edit the configuration file and load and prepare U-boot for the correct device, correct MCU, and the correct kernel that it should expect. So next up, we have to prepare the kernel. I'm just going to kind of briefly glance over this one, because it's not really something that this talk is about. We're talking about the bootloader. But we have to compile the kernel for the correct architecture and everything else. Load the necessary drivers, maybe some software, and prepare the device tree. And essentially, once we have this done, we can package the bootloader, the kernel, and everything else, the device tree, into what's called a fit image. And I'll talk a bit more about fit images and signing them later. But it allows us it bundles them all together in a structured way, together with the signatures, which can be then verified by our ROM code. And finally, this just gets loaded onto an SD card, or if it's in a factory, it might be loaded onto a memory chip. And then this gets put into the embedded device. Next, we have chain of trust. So as I mentioned before, embedded devices these days usually don't have, per se, as computers would have a TPM, or a trusted platform module, which establishes the hardware root of trust. This is usually done via if it's done via the ROM code. And the chain of trust, it ensures that only the verified software is executed, and it contains, essentially it contains almost the root certificates, to put it into IT terms, inside the ROM, or sometimes inside some OTP, one-time programmable chips inside the device, which then once the ROM code starts, it searches to the storage device, finds the first stage bootloader or the SPL, compares the certificate, so the signature of it inside of the fit tree, and decides to either allow it to load or not. And next up, we have the loading of the full bootloader, which, as I mentioned, gets again verified by the SPL. And without the TPM, these devices, oftentimes the security is not there because it's not easy to implement this measure in ROM. A lot of MCUs actually support it, but it requires you to actually get the proper signatures from the factory and things like that. And then we have, that's pretty much everything is sort of packaged together inside the fit file, as I mentioned before. And now we have the famous signatures. And here's kind of on the slide, I'm showing you a few flags that need to be set in U-boot, because the U-boot is a very environment variable driven configuration. So things are not flags inside of for instance, the tool chain, but it's a very long config file with a couple hundred of these environment variables that you can switch on or off. So having a bootloader signing essentially enables something that's called high assurance boot or hub, and it's all about making sure that only the verified firmware runs on the device. And then we have here we have a few of these examples. So config secure boot, this is the first flag you need to enable to have even some form of signing in place. Then you have the fit and the fit signature, which is the flag that tells U-boot that U-boot and the U-boot SPL, that it should look for these signatures inside a flattened image tree, because if you have these flags off, it's basically not going to know if there's any signatures inside of the fit, and just going to skip any verification steps at all. And then you have to also provide the device tree file into the bootloader, so it knows, because that also gets signed together and needs to be verified. Because you can, for instance, you could potentially trigger some fault conditions if you feeded an incorrect device tree, and that might lead to exploits. Personally, I don't think, not that I know of, there were none exploits, including a faulty device tree. But it's an option that kind of U-boot the developers wanted to prevent. And next we have the U-boot environment. So as I mentioned before, the U-boot environment is very environment variable driven. So everything will be a flag here. And it can leave several risks with it. So there's a few steps we can take to essentially protect this. This slide and the slide we had before is kind of the 80-20 rule. So for instance, you can get 80% of the safety by just these few flags, and then the last 20% you have to dive a bit deeper. So one of the biggest attack surfaces in U-boot is the serial console. And this is oftentimes not protected, as I mentioned before, the case when I bought a second-hand router just to experiment around with. And I tried probing the UART shell with a bus pirate, and I just got a root shell, and I could access all the files inside the file system, and which included users' previous passwords, SSID, and everything for the Wi-Fi. And this was a few-year-old model. So maybe I think it was like 2017. I think it was a model. So things like this are still laziness wins. And unless you have a very good reason, do not leave a UART shell open on your device. And I would say the first thing that you can do if you for some reason need a URL open, for instance, if it's a potentially if that's your only way to update the device or things like that, then you can leave it. You can leave it open, but it's strongly recommended for it to be password protected. So here you have a prompt it'll give you and the delay string while it waits for the given, because U-boot always waits in the default configuration for a few seconds before it moves on to the kernel booting. And then you have those few seconds to interrupt the boot, and then it asks you for a password. And you can either have it in plain text, so there is a version of the auto boot stop string, which is not SHA-256, which would be if you should have their plain text password. But again, if it's that easy, why have it the plain text if you can have it hashed inside of there? And the thing is, because the U-boot shell offers a very wide range of commands to interact with the system and modify the boot parameters. So if someone were to gain access to a VR root shell, as I said, they could read any files on the device, they could modify the U-boot potentially, they could load a different version or replace it completely with something with their own bootloader. So this is kind of how supply chain attacks happen. So if you're shipping your embedded device to a highly secure area, and if you don't have the URL password protected, then attackers can simply intercept the shipment. Again, it's talking about highly complex attack chains for nation state level adversaries, but still it's a possibility. So if it's this easy, it's a few lines in the configuration file, why not enable it? It's kind of begs the question. And in summary, the console essentially is the living and breathing part of U-boot and what allows it to be so flexible. So don't leave it open. And as I said, if you don't have the need for a shell, which for production environments you shouldn't have a need for a shell. If you're, let's say, a company shipping out new smart thermostats, you don't need users to have a shell on it. So you can just disable it completely using the flag which I separated there on the bottom, the config disable console. So this is kind of summing up from our talks, from my talk. You can rate it here. I said, like, bootloader security, it might not be the popular topic these days and not that frequently talked about, but it's very important because these days every freaking smart device is basically a Linux box, and most companies don't even have them, for instance, on a separate VLAN. So if someone manages to compromise your thermostat or your smart presentation board, then they would have direct access to your network just like that. And I think that's everything for our presentation. Thank you for watching, and let's see if we have any questions on the chat. So we have a question: how do you handle anti-rollback mechanism how does anti-rollback mechanism handle large increments? Can you increment the version by a huge number that will effectively roll it back? Actually, that's a very good question, which I haven't personally tried it, but these are actually, I wonder how I would have to try that and how to take it offline. But if you want, we can connect on LinkedIn, and I can let you know what I find out. But this is usually I don't think it would work because these are hardware counters. So I think usually the mechanism there is just to error out in case anything goes wrong. Like if you have some device configured with a well-configured high assurance boot, any sign of error, it would basically halt the boot process and prevent it from booting. So it's a very good question. But the thing is that the anti-rollback mechanism is important only if you don't have if you don't have other measures in place, which I wouldn't start there. And also, it's a pretty niche feature. And I agree that the solution is less smart devices. And yeah, you can't unsolder smart SoC device memory on the SoC devices. Well, you could either swap out the entire chip, but that's not really feasible. But actually, a lot of devices do have just memory chips soldered next to them. So I was talking about those before. Like for instance, you can dump the firmware off of any device easily. For instance, I did it recently with I did it on the same router I got. I desoldered the chip and just throw it into XGeku memory reader, and you can read it like that. That's talking about flash reading. So I hope that answers everyone's question. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can probably give the people a minute more, and then we can leave it here and give room for the next presentation and break for everyone. Hey, glad to see all the thumbs up on the chat. And I think there aren't any more questions, so we can probably leave it here. Thank you everyone for listening. Hope this was useful and hope this was some takeaways for if there are any embedded device developers out there. And see you on the next talk, where I'll be again as a chairman.